On the 4th day of June in 1942, the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean to illuminate what would become one of history's most significant naval engagements. Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood watching his crews prepare for yet another operation. This was the same officer who had coordinated the devastating assault on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The preparations that morning followed patterns established through countless previous missions. Crews moved efficiently across the flight deck, positioning aircraft while fuel lines stretched across the wooden planking. Ordnance teams wheeled bombs and torpedoes toward waiting planes. The smell of aviation gasoline mixed with ocean salt filled the air as the massive vessel rolled gently in the swells, its engines maintaining a steady rhythm below. Shortly after 10 o'clock that morning, lookouts called out warnings of aircraft diving from extreme altitude. What happened in the next 6 minutes would fundamentally reshape the entire Pacific War. 3 of Japan's 4 carriers operating near Midway Island would be reduced to flaming wreckage. The Akagi, serving as flagship for the strike force, suffered mortal damage. The Kaga, which had participated in every major operation since December, became engulfed in flames throughout its entire length. The Soryu, representing the newest generation of fleet carriers, was torn apart by explosions erupting from within. The men serving aboard these vessels, all veterans of continuous victories and confident in both their equipment and abilities, experienced something completely outside their expectations. Their destruction came not through hours of sustained combat or extended engagements with traded blows, but through 5 minutes of remarkably accurate dive bombing that caught them at their most vulnerable moment. The question that would trouble Japanese naval commanders for the remainder of the conflict, and that American historians would analyze for decades afterward, wasn't simply about the mechanics of what occurred. The principles of dive bombing were thoroughly understood. American SBD Dauntless aircraft had demonstrated their ability to drop 1,000-pound bombs with accuracy sufficient to strike moving vessels. The genuine question was both psychological and strategic in nature. How had the Japanese Navy, which just 6 months earlier had executed the most devastating carrier strike in naval history at Pearl Harbor, found itself in circumstances where 5 minutes could eliminate the core of its offensive capability? How had a force that had swept Allied naval power from the Western Pacific, that had destroyed British battleships near Malaya, and devastated the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor, become so vulnerable that a relatively small group of dive bomber pilots could effectively terminate Japan's offensive capacity across the Pacific? The answer wasn't found in those 5 minutes themselves, but rather in the decisions, assumptions, and convictions that had brought the Japanese Navy to that specific moment. It existed within a doctrine centered on decisive engagement that had influenced Japanese naval philosophy for 4 decades. It resided in a series of victories that had validated every assumption Japanese strategists had formulated about their capabilities and their adversaries' limitations. It was present in the particular choices made that morning aboard the Japanese carriers, decisions that appeared entirely logical, given what the Japanese understood or believed they understood about their situation. To comprehend how 5 minutes near Midway could destroy 4 aircraft carriers and fundamentally alter the trajectory of the Pacific War, we must first understand what the Japanese Navy believed about itself, its equipment, its opponents, and the fundamental nature of modern naval combat. We must grasp the foundation of assurance that had been constructed through meticulous planning, demanding training, and repeated successes. Only then can we appreciate the scale of what transpired in those 5 minutes and recognize why the psychological consequences were as devastating as the physical. Losses, the Japanese Navy sailing toward Midway in June 1942 was far from an inexperienced force operating on theoretical principles and optimistic hopes. This was a battle-tested fleet that had accomplished every objective assigned to it with methodical precision. During the 6 months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval forces had operated across the Pacific and Indian Oceans in a conquest campaign unprecedented in naval history. They had eliminated Allied naval capability from Hawaii to Ceylon, seizing territory and resources across an area exceeding the size of the continental United States. The foundation of this achievement rested upon carrier aviation capabilities. Japan had recognized earlier than most naval powers that aircraft carriers would prove decisive in Pacific warfare. While other nations continued debating whether battleships or carriers should constitute the primary fleet strength, Japan had committed to carrier striking power as early as the 1920s. By 1941, the Japanese Navy possessed what were unquestionably the world's finest carrier pilots. These were men who had accumulated thousands of training hours and gained actual combat experience in China. These pilots could land on carrier decks in conditions that would prevent American or British aviators from attempting operations. They could navigate across hundreds of miles of open ocean and strike targets with remarkable precision. They operated aircraft specifically engineered for carrier missions, including the Zero fighter and the Type 97 carrier attack plane, both superior to their Allied equivalents in range and maneuverability. The carriers themselves represented the culmination of Japanese naval engineering expertise. Both Akagi and Kaga were conversions from capital ships, modified and enhanced throughout the 1930s to become fast, capable carriers. Soryu and Hiryu were purpose-designed fleet carriers, incorporating lessons absorbed from earlier designs. These vessels could launch and recover aircraft rapidly, could maintain operations across enormous distances, and carried veteran deck crews capable of rearming and refueling aircraft with exceptional speed. The entire system, encompassing ship design, aircrew training, and operational doctrine, had been refined through years of planning and practical application. Pearl Harbor had validated this system spectacularly. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft against the American Pacific Fleet base in Hawaii. The assault was executed with precision that astonished American observers. Japanese pilots struck their designated targets methodically, sinking or severely damaging 8 battleships, destroying 188 aircraft, and killing 2,403 Americans. The Japanese lost 29 aircraft and fewer than 100 personnel. This represented the most lopsided naval victory in modern history, achieved through carrier aviation against a fortified naval installation. Pearl Harbor marked only the beginning. In the weeks and months following, Japanese carrier forces demonstrated their capabilities throughout the Pacific. During January 1942, carriers supported the invasion of Rabaul, establishing a base that would control the South Pacific for years. In February, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Darwin, Australia, in an operation that destroyed shipping and facilities with efficiency matching that demonstrated at Pearl Harbor. In April, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo led a carrier raid into the Indian Ocean, resulting in the sinking of the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and numerous merchant vessels. British Admiral Sir James Somerville, commanding the Eastern Fleet, withdrew to East Africa rather than engage the Japanese carriers in open combat. The Indian Ocean, for all practical purposes, became a Japanese-controlled body of water. These victories weren't accidental outcomes. They reflected a naval doctrine developed and refined over decades. Japanese naval strategists had studied Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905 and extracted specific lessons about the importance of decisive engagement. They believed modern naval warfare, like warfare throughout history, would be determined by a single climactic encounter between fleet forces. The side capable of massing its strength and achieving surprise in that decisive battle would secure victory in the war. Everything in Japanese naval planning oriented toward preparing for this moment. The concept of decisive battle, what Japanese naval officers termed kantai kessen, wasn't merely a tactical preference. It represented strategic necessity arising from Japan's geographic and industrial position. Japanese planners acknowledged that their nation could not sustain an extended war of attrition against the United States. American industrial capacity was approximately 10 times greater than Japan's. American access to raw materials, particularly petroleum and steel, vastly exceeded Japanese resources. In any prolonged conflict, these advantages would prove overwhelming. Japan's sole path to victory required achieving decisive results rapidly, compelling the Americans to accept negotiated peace before their industrial power could be fully mobilized. This strategic reality shaped every aspect of Japanese naval preparation. The fleet trained obsessively for the decisive engagement. Pilots practiced until their skills surpassed those of any other navy worldwide. Gunnery crews drilled until they could fire with accuracy that American observers would later characterize as remarkable. Night fighting techniques were developed to a degree unmatched by Western navies. Torpedo technology advanced to produce the Type 93 Long Lance, a weapon with superior range and destructive power compared to any equivalent American or British torpedo. Every component of the fleet, from the newest destroyer to the most powerful battleship, was designed and trained to function in the decisive battle that would determine the war's outcome. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet, understood this doctrine intimately. He had studied at Harvard, had served as naval attaché in Washington, and comprehended America's industrial potential better than most Japanese officers. He had opposed war with the United States, recognizing the long-term impossibility of Japanese victory. However, once ordered to prepare for war, he had developed a strategy designed to provide Japan its optimal chance. Strike first with overwhelming force and destroy. Sufficient American fleet strength that the United States would accept negotiated settlement, rather than commit to years of costly warfare across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had constituted the initial step in this strategy. Midway was intended as the culmination. By capturing Midway Island, Japan would eliminate the American base threatening Japanese-controlled Wake Island. More significantly, the operation would compel American carriers into a decisive engagement. American doctrine, Yamamoto calculated, would require the U.S. Navy to defend Midway. When American carriers deployed to intercept the invasion force, Japanese carriers would be positioned to ambush and destroy them. With American carrier forces eliminated, with no naval aviation to contest Japanese operations, the United States would be compelled to accept Japanese supremacy in the Western Pacific. The decisive battle would be won, and the war with it. This confidence wasn't unfounded optimism. Every engagement since Pearl Harbor had validated Japanese assumptions. At the Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942, Japanese cruisers and destroyers had destroyed an Allied naval force attempting to prevent the invasion of Java. In the Coral Sea in early May, Japanese and American carriers had fought the first engagement in naval history, where surface ships never achieved visual contact. Both sides lost carriers, but the Japanese believed they had sunk 2 American carriers while losing only 1 light carrier themselves. The actual result was more balanced, with each side losing 1 carrier, but Japanese reports indicated a clear victory. From the Japanese perspective, the pattern persisted. They attacked, achieved objectives, and inflicted greater losses than they sustained. By early June 1942, Japanese naval officers possessed every reason for confidence. Their carriers were veteran vessels with experienced crews. Their pilots were the finest worldwide. Their doctrine had been validated through 6 months of continuous success. The operation planned for Midway represented the most ambitious yet undertaken, involving multiple fleet elements coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean, but complexity didn't concern them. They had executed equally complex operations successfully at Pearl Harbor and throughout the South Pacific. Admiral Nagumo, who would command the carrier striking force at Midway, had led every major carrier operation since the war began. His staff officers understood their responsibilities. His pilots trusted their equipment. His ships functioned with efficiency derived from constant operations. Everything indicated that Midway would produce another Japanese victory, perhaps the decisive one that would terminate effective American resistance in the Pacific. The Japanese carriers approached their launch position northwest of Midway in the pre-dawn darkness of June 4, 1942. Admiral Nagumo's orders were explicit. Launch a strike against Midway's airfield and installations to neutralize land-based aircraft that could threaten the invasion force. Maintain a reserve strike force armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs in case American carriers appeared. The Japanese didn't anticipate American carriers would be present. Intelligence suggested the American fleet remained near Hawaii, too distant to interfere with the Midway operation. This intelligence was catastrophically incorrect. However, Nagumo had no means of knowing this as his carriers turned into the wind to launch aircraft. At 4:30 in the morning, the first wave began departing. 108 aircraft, a mixed formation of bombers and fighters, headed toward Midway. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike. He was an experienced pilot, veteran of multiple operations, and understood his mission thoroughly. Suppress Midway's defenses, destroy aircraft on the ground, neutralize the island's capacity to interfere with the invasion. Behind him on the carrier decks, 93 aircraft remained as the reserve strike force. These planes were armed for naval engagement with torpedoes for attack bombers and armor-piercing bombs for dive bombers. If American ships appeared, Nagumo could launch immediately against them. What transpired in the subsequent several hours created conditions for disaster. Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 93 miles range. American aircraft launched to intercept. Marine fighters, mostly obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of Wildcats met the Japanese formation. The combat was decidedly one-sided. Japanese Zeros shot down most Marine fighters with minimal losses. The Japanese strike proceeded to its target, Tomonaga's bombers struck Midway's installations, destroying fuel tanks, damaging the powerhouse, hitting buildings and aircraft. However, the airfield remained operational. Critically, American aircraft continued departing during the attack. Tomonaga radioed Nagumo at 7 o'clock in the morning with a straightforward message. A second strike was necessary. This presented Nagumo with a decision. His reserve aircraft were armed for naval engagement. To conduct another strike on Midway, they would require rearming with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. The process would consume approximately 1 hour. Torpedoes would need removal, bombs brought up from magazines, aircraft repositioned on the deck. During this time, the carriers would be vulnerable if American ships appeared. However, Nagumo's intelligence still indicated no American carriers were nearby. At 7:15, he ordered the reserve aircraft rearmed for a second Midway strike. The deck crews began their work. Torpedoes were removed from aircraft and returned to magazines below deck. High explosive bombs were brought up and prepared for loading. The work proceeded methodically but created disorder on the carrier decks. Aircraft were moved to allow access to ordnance. Fuel lines remained connected to planes awaiting refueling. Bombs and torpedoes sat temporarily on the decks while crews worked. This was routine disorder, the normal chaos of carrier operations, nothing that concerned experienced deck officers. At 7:28, a Japanese scout plane radioed a report that would alter everything. The pilot had spotted American ships. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming halted. If American carriers were present, he needed his torpedo bombers ready to attack them. At 7:45, the scout plane transmitted another message confirming the presence of what appeared to be an American carrier. Nagumo now confronted an impossible situation. His decks were cluttered with aircraft in various states of rearming. His first strike force was returning from Midway, critically low on fuel, requiring immediate landing. American carrier aircraft were presumably inbound. He needed to clear his decks, recover his returning aircraft, rearm and refuel them, then launch a coordinated strike against the American carriers. The decision he made next was tactically sound given his information, but would prove catastrophic in its consequences. Nagumo ordered his carriers to recover the Midway strike force first. This followed doctrine. Aircraft returning from a mission, low on fuel, took priority. Once they were aboard, once they were refueled and rearmed, he could launch a properly coordinated strike against the Americans with his full strength. The alternative, launching a hasty piecemeal attack with whatever aircraft were ready, violated Japanese doctrine and invited defeat in detail. Therefore, the carriers turned into the wind. Deck crews cleared landing areas. The first aircraft from Midway began touching down at 8:37. The recovery continued for the next hour and a half. During this period, the Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable, unable to launch strikes, decks cluttered with aircraft, fuel lines exposed, bombs and torpedoes stacked awaiting proper storage. The American carriers that Nagumo's scout had spotted were Task Force 16 and Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, respectively. These forces included the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been damaged at Coral Sea and patched up in just 3 days at Pearl Harbor, work that would normally require 3 months. She wasn't fully repaired, but she was operational, and every carrier mattered. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming because they had broken Japanese naval codes. Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had decrypted sufficient Japanese communications to determine that a major operation was planned against Midway. The Americans had positioned their carriers northeast of Midway in a location to ambush the Japanese when they attacked the island. Fletcher, as senior officer, commanded the combined task force. At 6:03 in the morning, after receiving reports of the Japanese strike on Midway, he ordered Spruance to proceed southwest and attack the Japanese carriers, while Fletcher recovered scout aircraft from Yorktown. Spruance pushed his carriers forward at maximum speed. His staff calculated the Japanese carriers' probable position based on the reported course and speed of aircraft that had struck Midway. At 7:02, Spruance made a crucial decision. He ordered his aircraft launched immediately at extreme range to catch the Japanese carriers while they were recovering their Midway strike force. This decision meant American aircraft would have barely sufficient fuel for the mission. They would be at the limit of their combat radius. Some might not return. However, Spruance recognized the opportunity. If his strike caught the Japanese carriers while they were landing aircraft, unable to launch fighters, the Americans might achieve devastating surprise. At 7:52, Enterprise began launching aircraft. Hornet followed minutes later. The American strike force consisted of 116 aircraft, every available bomber and torpedo plane from both carriers. The fighters remained back to defend the carriers themselves, a decision that would prove costly for the attacking bombers, but reflected American doctrine prioritizing carrier defense. The American formations climbed away from their carriers, heading southwest toward where the Japanese should be. They flew individually by squadron rather than waiting to form a coordinated strike group. This meant they would attack piecemeal, torpedo bombers and dive bombers arriving separately rather than simultaneously. However, it also meant they would arrive sooner, catching the Japanese during the recovery and rearming process. What followed was a series of American attacks that appeared to validate every Japanese assumption about American naval aviation. Starting at 9:30, torpedo bombers from Hornet located the Japanese carriers and pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage. They came in low, slow, vulnerable, without fighter escort. Japanese Zeros and anti-aircraft fire destroyed them systematically. Of 15 torpedo bombers from Hornet's VT-8 squadron, only one pilot survived. Torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown met similar fates. The torpedoes they managed to launch were ineffective, running too deep or failing to detonate. Not a single American torpedo hit a Japanese carrier that morning. 41 torpedo bombers attacked, 35 were shot down, 0 hits achieved. From the Japanese perspective, this confirmed their superiority in combat efficiency and equipment quality. However, the torpedo attacks accomplished something the Americans could not have deliberately planned. They drew down the Japanese combat air patrol. The Zeros defending the carriers descended to wave-top altitude to intercept the torpedo bombers. Japanese attention focused on the immediate visible threat at sea level. Nobody was watching the sky at 14,000 feet, where American dive bombers were approaching. At 10:22 in the morning, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, spotted the Japanese carriers. He had been searching for over an hour, fuel running critically low, about to turn back, when he noticed a Japanese destroyer moving at high speed. He followed its wake and found the carriers. Below him, McCluskey observed all 4 Japanese carriers. They were in the process of launching their strike against the American carriers. Aircraft were spotted on decks, engines running, fuel lines still connected. Bombs and torpedoes were visible on the decks awaiting final loading. It was the perfect target. Carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. No fighters at altitude to interfere with the attack. McCluskey pushed over into his dive at 10:22. 37 dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown followed him down. The first bomb struck Kaga at 10:26 in the morning. The explosion tore through the flight deck near the amidship elevator. The bomb, a 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapon designed to penetrate battleship decks, went through the wooden flight deck and exploded in the hangar deck below. The hangar was filled with aircraft, some being refueled, some being rearmed, all packed closely together. Aviation fuel lines were exposed. Torpedoes and bombs were stacked, waiting to be loaded. The explosion ignited fuel vapor. Fire spread instantly through the hangar. A second bomb hit moments later, striking near the aft elevator, creating another massive explosion in the hangar space. The fires reached stored ordnance. Bombs began exploding. Torpedoes detonated. The entire stern section of the ship became an inferno. On Akagi's bridge, Commander Fuchida, who had been wounded in the leg during an American attack earlier that morning, watched in disbelief as his ship was transformed into a flaming wreck in seconds. He had stood on this deck when Akagi launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had watched Japanese precision destroy the American battle line. Now he watched American precision destroy his ship. The fires spread forward through the hangar. Fueled aircraft on the flight deck began burning. Men trapped below decks screamed as fire and smoke consumed the hangar spaces. Damage control parties attempted to fight the fires, but were driven back by intense heat and secondary explosions. The ship's fire mains had been damaged by the bomb hits. Water pressure failed. There was no way to control the fires spreading through the ship. Kaga was hit simultaneously. 3 bombs struck in rapid succession. The first hit forward on the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar and igniting aircraft and fuel. The second struck amidships, destroying the bridge and killing most senior officers instantly. The third hit aft, creating another massive explosion in the hangar deck. Like Akagi, Kaga's hangar was filled with armed and fueled aircraft. The bombs started fires that spread through the ship with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the entire hangar deck was burning. Explosions ripped through the ship as stored ammunition detonated. The forward elevator was blown completely off the ship by an internal explosion. The massive steel platform was thrown hundreds of feet into the air before crashing into the sea. Soryu was the third carrier hit. 3 bombs struck between 10:25 and 10:27. The bombs came from Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, which had approached from a different direction than Enterprise's aircraft. Soryu's deck was crowded with aircraft preparing to launch. The first bomb hit near the forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar and exploding among parked aircraft. The second hit amidships on the flight deck, its explosion igniting fuel and ammunition. The third struck aft. Within moments, Soryu was burning along her entire length. The fires reached the torpedo storage spaces. Torpedoes began detonating, each explosion tearing apart more of the ship's internal structure. The carrier became a floating volcano, flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, smoke visible for 50 miles. The attacks lasted 5 minutes. American dive bomber pilots pulling out of their dives looked back to see all 3 carriers burning. Some pilots later reported that they initially thought they were looking at one carrier hit multiple times until they realized there were 3 separate fires, 3 carriers destroyed. The scene was almost incomprehensible in its totality. The core of the Japanese carrier striking force, the ships that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had ranged across the Pacific in 6 months of unbroken victory, were burning wrecks. The aircrews that would have launched Japan's counter-strike were dead or dying in the flames. The aircraft that would have attacked the American carriers were exploding on the hangar decks. The mechanics, the armorers, the experienced deck crews who made carrier operations possible were trapped below decks in spaces filling with fire and toxic smoke. On Hiryu, the only Japanese carrier not yet hit, Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi watched the disaster unfold. His carrier was separated from the others by several miles. American dive bombers had not spotted her during their initial attack. Yamaguchi immediately ordered his aircraft launched against the Americans. He would strike back with everything he had. However, he was launching fewer than 20 aircraft, all that remained ready from the reserve that had been held back, against 3 American carriers with full combat air patrols and anti-aircraft defenses. It was a desperate gesture. The Japanese had planned to launch over 100 aircraft in a coordinated strike. Now they were sending fewer than 20. The fires aboard Akagi, Kaga and Soryu burned with intensity that defeated every effort to control them. On Akagi, Admiral Nagumo remained on the bridge as long as possible, watching his flagship die around him. Damage control parties fought desperately to contain the fires, but the situation was hopeless. The bomb hits had destroyed fire mains and ruptured fuel lines. Aviation gasoline fed the flames. Each new explosion spread fire to areas not yet burning. By 11 o'clock in the morning, less than an hour after the bombs hit, the entire ship was engulfed. The heat became unbearable on the bridge. Steel bulkheads glowed red, paint blistered and ignited spontaneously. Nagumo's staff urged him to transfer his flag to a destroyer. He refused at first, unwilling to abandon his ship while men were still fighting below. Finally, at 10:46, with the bridge itself beginning to burn, Nagumo climbed down to a waiting boat. He transferred to the light cruiser Nagara and watched Akagi burn from a distance of several miles. The scenes aboard the dying carriers were nightmarish. Men trapped below decks by spreading fires faced choices no human should face. Some attempted to reach topside through passages filling with smoke. Others, cut off by flames, gathered in compartments that became ovens as the fires approached. The heat was so intense that steel bulkheads transmitted it to adjacent spaces, killing men through radiant heat before flames actually reached them. Survivors who made it to the flight deck found themselves on islands of steel, surrounded by fire. Some jumped into the sea, swimming away from their burning ships. Others remained aboard, helping wounded shipmates, or continuing to fight fires in areas not yet consumed. The discipline that had made the Japanese Navy feared throughout. The Pacific remained intact even as the ships died. Kaga burned even more intensely than Akagi. The bomb that had destroyed her bridge killed her captain and most senior officers immediately. The surviving officers had no communication with most of the ship. Fires isolated different sections. Men fought independently without coordination, some not even knowing the extent of the damage. In the engine rooms far below, engineering crews maintained power and steam pressure, even as temperatures rose to unbearable levels. They knew the ship was dying, but they kept the engines running so pumps could deliver water to firefighting teams. Many of these men never made it out. They remained at their posts until heat and smoke overcame them. When Kaga was finally abandoned late in the afternoon, Hundreds of men were still trapped below. The ship was so hot that paint on nearby destroyers blistered from radiant heat when they approached to pick up survivors. Soryu died fastest of the 3 carriers hit in the initial attack. The torpedo explosions in her storage spaces broke her back structurally. The ship began settling rapidly by the bow. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, ordered the ship abandoned at 10:45, only 18 minutes after the first bomb hit. Crew members begged him to leave. He refused, choosing to go down with his ship. He remained on the bridge as Soryu's bow submerged. The carrier slipped beneath the waves at 7:13 in the evening, taking Captain Yanagimoto and hundreds of crew members with her. She was the first of the 3 carriers to sink. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, continued operations while her sister ships burned. Admiral Yamaguchi launched 2 small strikes against the American carriers during the afternoon. His aircraft found Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier was severely damaged and would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. However, Yorktown's sacrifice bought time for Enterprise and Hornet to locate Hiryu. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Japanese carrier. They attacked from high altitude, achieving complete surprise. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The carrier suffered the same fate as her sisters. Fires spread through the hangar deck. Explosions destroyed damage control capability. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk drifting dead in the water. Admiral Yamaguchi refused evacuation. He chose to die with his ship, as did Hiryu's captain. The carrier sank early on the morning of June 5th. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of its naval striking power. However, the material losses, as catastrophic as they were, did not fully represent the disaster. Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, bombers and fighters that could not be quickly replaced. More critically, Japan had lost the aircrews, the mechanics, the armorers, the experienced deck personnel who made carrier operations possible. These men represented years of training, combat experience that could not be transmitted through instruction. A pilot who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had flown combat missions across the Pacific, who knew how to land on a carrier deck at night in rough seas, was irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers given time and resources. Japan could manufacture new aircraft. However, Japan could not recreate the institutional knowledge and combat experience that died in the fires at Midway. The survivors brought back to Japan, in the weeks after Midway, carried with them something more dangerous than physical wounds. They carried the knowledge that the war could be lost. Japanese naval officers who had believed in inevitable victory, who had trained their entire careers for the decisive battle that would confirm Japan's dominance, had witnessed the decisive battle go catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not fought according to Japanese expectations. American dive bombers had achieved a level of precision Japanese planners had not credited to American pilots. American intelligence had positioned carriers exactly where they needed to be, suggesting the Americans had better information than Japanese security had considered possible. American industrial capacity, already recognized as superior, now appeared even more formidable, given how quickly the damaged Yorktown had been returned to service. The Japanese Navy attempted to suppress information about the magnitude of the defeat. Officers and enlisted men returning from Midway were ordered not to discuss what had happened. They were dispersed to different units and bases to prevent them from forming groups that might spread demoralization. Official reports minimized losses and emphasized damage inflicted on American forces. The Japanese public was told that Midway had been a victory, that American carriers had been sunk, that Japanese forces had achieved their objectives. However, within the Navy itself, the truth could not be hidden. Too many ships had not returned. Too many experienced officers and men were dead. The 4 carriers that had formed the core of Japanese striking power since Pearl Harbor were gone, and everyone in the naval service knew it. The psychological impact extended beyond simple knowledge of defeat. The speed of the disaster shattered assumptions about Japanese superiority and combat efficiency. 5 minutes had been sufficient to destroy 3 carriers. The coordination required for American dive bombers from 2 different carriers to attack simultaneously suggested a level of operational capability Japanese planners had not attributed to the Americans. The fact that this had happened while Japanese fighters were overhead, while the carriers were preparing their own strike, while everything seemed under control, demonstrated that American forces could exploit moments of vulnerability with devastating effectiveness. The Japanese Navy had planned for the decisive battle. They had not planned to lose it so quickly, so completely, so irreversibly. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato several hundred miles behind the carriers, received reports of the disaster with growing dismay. He had gambled on Midway, bringing about the decisive battle that would destroy American carrier power. Instead, he had lost his own carriers, while the Americans retained 2 operational carriers and would soon bring more into service. Yamamoto considered bringing his battleships forward to engage the American carriers in a night surface action, but his staff convinced him the risk was too great. The Americans could avoid battle, and even if engaged, modern carriers could launch strikes against battleships at ranges where the battleship's guns were useless. Yamamoto ordered the entire operation cancelled. Japanese forces withdrew from Midway without attempting the planned invasion. The operation, designed to extend Japan's defensive perimeter and destroy American naval power, had accomplished neither objective. The strategic implications became clear in the months following Midway. Japan could no longer conduct offensive operations on the scale achieved in the war's first 6 months. The loss of 4 carriers meant that Japanese naval aviation could no longer dominate large areas of ocean. American forces, recognizing the shift in the balance of power, began limited offensive operations. In August 1942, Marines landed on Guadalcanal, beginning a 6-month campaign that would further deplete Japanese naval and air strength. Japan had new carriers under construction, but they would not be ready for more than a year. Shokaku and Zuikaku, 2 fleet carriers that had not been present at Midway, could not by themselves provide the striking power that 4 carriers had offered. Japanese naval strategy after Midway became increasingly defensive. Rather than seeking the decisive battle on terms favorable to Japan, the Navy found itself responding to American initiatives. Each engagement depleted irreplaceable resources. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Japanese carriers damaged Enterprise but lost aircraft and pilots they could not replace. At the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in October, the carrier Hornet was sunk, but Japanese aircraft losses were so severe that their carriers had to withdraw from the area. By the end of 1942, Japan had won tactical victories but lost the strategic initiative. The confidence that had characterized Japanese naval operations in the war's first 6 months was gone, replaced by grim awareness that the war was becoming one of attrition, the type of war Japan could not win. The story of what happened after Midway is the story of inevitable decline. Japan continued fighting for more than 3 years after June 4, 1942. Japanese forces won battles, achieved local successes, and demonstrated tactical skill and courage that commanded respect even from their enemies. However, the trajectory established at Midway never changed. Japan was losing, slowly but inexorably, to an enemy with greater resources, greater industrial capacity, and growing combat effectiveness. The decisive battle doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval strategy for 40 years had been tested at Midway and found catastrophically inadequate for modern industrial warfare. The carriers lost at Midway were eventually replaced, but never adequately. Taiho, launched in 1943, was a modern fleet carrier incorporating lessons learned from combat experience. She was sunk by an American submarine on her first operation in June 1944. Shinano, converted from a battleship hull, was the largest carrier built during World War II. She was sunk by a submarine 10 days after being commissioned, before carrying out a single combat operation. Japan built carriers, but American submarines sank them faster than Japanese industry could replace them. By 1945, Japan had no operational carriers capable of conducting offensive missions. The Naval Air Service that had been the finest in the world in December 1941 existed only as a shadow of its former capability, reduced to kamikaze attacks because trained pilots no longer existed in sufficient numbers for conventional operations. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, continued operations while her sister ships burned. Admiral Yamaguchi launched 2 small strikes against the American carriers during the afternoon. His aircraft found Yorktown and hit her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier was severely damaged and would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow. However, Yorktown's sacrifice bought time for Enterprise and Hornet to locate Hiryu. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Japanese carrier. They attacked from high altitude, achieving complete surprise. 4 bombs hit Hiryu in rapid succession. The carrier suffered the same fate as her sisters. Fires spread through the hangar deck. Explosions destroyed damage control capability. By evening, Hiryu was a burning hulk drifting dead in the water. Admiral Yamaguchi refused evacuation. He chose to die with his ship, as did Hiryu's captain. The carrier sank early on the morning of June 5th. In less than 24 hours, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the core of its naval striking power. However, the material losses, as catastrophic as they were, did not fully represent the disaster. Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, bombers and fighters that could not be quickly replaced. More critically, Japan had lost the aircrews, the mechanics, the armorers, the experienced deck personnel who made carrier operations possible. These men represented years of training, combat experience that could not be transmitted through instruction. A pilot who had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had flown combat missions across the Pacific, who knew how to land on a carrier deck at night in rough seas, was irreplaceable. Japan could build new carriers given time and resources. Japan could manufacture new aircraft. However, Japan could not recreate the institutional knowledge and combat experience that died in the fires at Midway. The survivors brought back to Japan, in the weeks after Midway, carried with them something more dangerous than physical wounds. They carried the knowledge that the war could be lost. Japanese naval officers who had believed in inevitable victory, who had trained their entire careers for the decisive battle that would confirm Japan's dominance, had witnessed the decisive battle go catastrophically wrong. The Americans had not fought according to Japanese expectations. American dive bombers had achieved a level of precision Japanese planners had not credited to American pilots. American intelligence had positioned carriers exactly where they needed to be, suggesting the Americans had better information than Japanese security had considered possible. American industrial capacity, already recognized as superior, now appeared even more formidable given how quickly the damaged Yorktown had been returned to service.